Sit back for a moment and imagine a horizon where the sea never ends, a vast, endless blue that stretches so far you almost forget the world beyond it exists, and out there, isolated by thousands of miles of ocean, lies a piece of land so mysterious that even today science struggles to explain its secrets. This is Easter Island, or as its people once called it, Te Pito o Te Henua, the navel of the world, a place that feels less like a corner of Earth and more like a forgotten chapter of human history. The island is small, just 163 square kilometers, but it carries on its surface nearly 1,000 silent giants, the Moai, carved from volcanic stone, each statue looming with an expression that is at once blank yet hauntingly alive. How did they get here? Who carved them? And perhaps more importantly, why? Early European explorers who stumbled upon the island in the 18th century were struck with disbelief, asking how such a tiny barren land could support the people who created these colossal figures. Some claimed it was impossible, that another lost civilization must have built them, while others believed the islanders themselves were once more powerful and more numerous before catastrophe reduced them to only a fraction of their past. Theories swirl like the waves that batter the island's cliffs. Deforestation, famine, war, even ancient slave raids that nearly erased an entire people, but every explanation seems to open new questions. Because Easter Island isn't just a story of stone heads, it's a story of survival, collapse, and the haunting silence left behind when a society falls. And as we begin this journey, keep one thing in mind: the Moai do not speak, but their silence tells us more than words ever could. From above, Easter Island appears almost like a single brushstroke on an empty canvas, the nearest inhabited place more than 2,000 kilometers away. No ships, no radio towers, just the sound of waves breaking endlessly on volcanic rock. To live here is to live in isolation, and for the ancient Polynesian settlers who first arrived sometime between 800 and 1200 AD, this isolation was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, they had a world entirely their own, untouched by outsiders, and on the other, there was no one coming to help if things went wrong. Every crop, every tree, every bird, every scrap of stone mattered. Some researchers believe the island was once lush, covered with palms that reached high into the sky. But when Europeans arrived, they found almost nothing but grass, wind, and bare soil. What happened to the forest? Did people cut it all down to roll their statues across the land? Or did rats carried by canoes devour the seeds so that nothing grew back? Others argue the change was slower and more complex, a mix of human ambition and environmental fragility. But either way, the land we see now is only a shadow of what it once was. And yet even in this barren state, the islanders managed feats of engineering that boggle the mind, raising monuments that weighed up to 80 tons, moving them across kilometers of rough ground, and placing them upright, all without wheels, cranes, or metal. So we ask again, how did a people so cut off from the rest of the world manage to create one of the greatest mysteries of human civilization? And as we look closer, the silence of the Moai begins to feel less like stone and more like a warning echoing across centuries. Stand before a Moai and you begin to feel something almost indescribable, a weight that is not just physical but spiritual, as though the stone itself is listening, measuring you with its hollow eyes that stare endlessly toward the horizon. Each statue rises anywhere between 10 and 30 feet, carved with elongated features, strong noses, heavy brows, and lips pressed shut as if guarding a secret too dangerous to speak. They are not scattered randomly across the island, but positioned carefully, most of them facing inland, watching over villages long gone with their backs turned deliberately against the sea. Only a few gaze outward toward the waves, and those few seem to guard rather than welcome. Archaeologists tell us that these statues represent ancestors, chiefs, or powerful figures whose spirits continued to protect the people long after death, yet no written records remain to confirm this. All we have are oral traditions, fragmented, contradictory, and filtered through centuries of loss. Some researchers suggest the Moai were carved in a quarry at Rano Raraku, a volcanic crater, and then somehow transported miles across uneven land. How were they moved? Some argue they were dragged on sledges, others propose they were rocked from side to side like walking giants, but whichever method was used, the effort required a society with extraordinary coordination and purpose. Imagine hundreds of people hauling a figure that weighs as much as a blue whale across rugged ground with nothing but ropes, determination, and chance to keep rhythm. It is not just the physical challenge that stuns us, it is the cultural investment, the belief that such monumental labor was necessary, even sacred. Why devote so much of life's energy to raising silent watchers unless you truly believed that your very survival depended on their presence? And then there is the haunting reality. Most of the statues never made it to their final destinations. Many still lie half buried in the quarry, abandoned mid-carving, as if the sculptors dropped their tools and walked away forever. Did famine stop them, or war, or something even darker? Perhaps the statues themselves were victims of the same collapse that shattered the society which created them. We stand now among the ruins, asking questions the island refuses to answer, and in that silence the Moai remain what they have always been, stone faces watching the living, guardians of a mystery carved deep into the fabric of human history. At the heart of Rano Raraku lies a strange and unsettling scene, a quarry that feels less like a workshop and more like a graveyard of half-born titans. Here, dozens of Moai remain frozen in time, still tethered to the volcanic rock from which they were being carved, their outlines emerging but never freed, their faces tilted skyward as though waiting for a final breath that never came. Some are nearly finished, their features crisp and distinct, while others linger as faint shadows on the stone, nothing more than rough sketches abandoned in mid-thought. Walking through this crater is like trespassing in a sacred place where creation itself was interrupted, where ambition stretched further than reality could allow. How long did it take to sculpt a single statue? Some researchers estimate months, perhaps years of careful chiseling with only stone tools, generations passing down the craft as if it were a divine duty. But then, abruptly, the work ended. Why? Did the carvers face an enemy that forced them to flee, or did their world collapse under the weight of its own demands? The quarry is littered with tools left behind, rough picks made of harder basalt, silent echoes of hands that once gripped them with purpose. The wind that sweeps across the crater carries whispers, not just of labor but of stories untold, of chants and rituals, of human voices raised in unison as stone cracked under pressure. And yet here they remain, unfinished giants, guardians that never stood, eternal reminders that even the most determined vision can falter. Some scholars believe the sheer number of incomplete statues is evidence of overreach, that the society pushed itself too far, exhausting resources until collapse was inevitable. Others suggest something more cataclysmic interrupted the work, warfare, starvation, perhaps even disease carried across the ocean. The Moai of Rano Raraku are, therefore, not just statues but questions carved into stone, each one a frozen why that has no answer. They embody both triumph and tragedy, showing us how close the people of Rapa Nui came to achieving something monumental, only to stop just short of completion. And when you stand there, among those silent and half-formed faces, you cannot help but feel as though you are being watched by 1,000 unfinished thoughts, as though the quarry itself holds a secret that has no intention of being revealed. Picture this. A Moai freshly carved, its colossal body separated from the bedrock, now lying on the slopes of Rano Raraku, waiting to be moved. It weighs tens of tons, taller than most houses, and yet the people of Rapa Nui somehow transported it across miles of rugged, uneven land without metal, without wheels, without beasts of burden. How? This is where the mystery deepens. Some archaeologists suggest wooden sledges dragged by hundreds of men straining in rhythm, ropes pulling tight as chants filled the air to keep the effort synchronized. Others argue the statues were walked upright, rocked from side to side like great drunken giants, inching forward step by step, the ropes acting like puppet strings in the hands of those who guided them. In recent experiments, researchers tried this walking method, and indeed the statues could shuffle forward like enormous stone figures learning to dance, swaying as though alive. Imagine the sound, the creak of ropes, the groan of wood, the scrape of stone against earth, mixed with the beat of drums and the cries of leaders urging the workers onward. But the task was dangerous. If the rope slipped, if the statue tipped too far, it could crash and shatter. And indeed, broken moai are found scattered along ancient roads, lying face down as though they fell during a final desperate march. The roads themselves are clues curving gently across the island, lined with abandoned statues like milestones of failure, each one a testament to the unimaginable challenge of moving mountains with nothing but human strength and belief. Some researchers think these abandoned figures were not failures at all, but intentional markers, perhaps part of the island's ritual landscape, guiding pilgrims or dividing sacred spaces. Yet the unanswered question persists: why devote such tremendous energy to moving these statues at all? What force of faith were tombs? Had fear or promise could drive a people to sacrifice so much of their lives to shift stone across the land? To walk those paths today is to step into that riddle where every toppled moai whispers of both glory and ruin, of a journey that consumed an island and left behind more questions than answers. And so the mystery marches on, with stone giants as its only footprints. For centuries the moai stood silent, their faces impassive, their long noses and stern jaws gazing out over the island, but they were not complete until their eyes were set in place. Archaeological evidence suggests that coral and stone were carefully crafted into pupils, giving the statues a piercing, almost unsettling gaze. Imagine the moment when a group of islanders, after months or years of carving and hauling, finally place those gleaming white eyes with a dark stone iris into the hollow sockets. Suddenly the statue was alive, no longer just a block of stone but a presence, a guardian, a witness. Oral traditions say the moai embodied mana, a spiritual power believed to flow from the ancestors, and when the eyes were installed, that mana was activated. They watched over villages, protected crops, and linked the living to the dead. But there is an eerie duality here, because to be watched by stone is to be reminded of your own smallness, your own fragility under the weight of something eternal. The statues faced inward toward the island, not outward to sea, as if guarding their people rather than inviting outsiders. Each gaze carried authority, perhaps even fear, a silent reminder that the ancestors were always watching, always judging. And yet, these eyes raise questions too. Why coral? Why give sight to stone unless there was a deeper belief that these figures could see, could act, could enforce? Some suggest the eyes were used in rituals, installed only for ceremonies and then removed, lending a fleeting but powerful sense of life to the statues. Others wonder if the placement of the eyes marked moments of political change, the rise of a leader, or the consecration of sacred ground. To stand before a moai with its eyes intact is to feel the weight of being seen by the past, as though the dead themselves had returned to watch the living. Few of those eyes remain. Today, shattered or lost, their power dimmed, yet the knowledge of their existence transforms the way we see these statues. They were not simply carvings of stone. They were beings meant to look back at you, to measure you, to remind you of mysteries that still linger in their gaze. And when you imagine hundreds of them lined across the island, all watching, all silent, the air itself begins to feel heavier, as though the ancestors still hold dominion over every breath of wind and wave that touches Rapa Nui. The moai stand as guardians of mystery, but behind their silent faces lies the shadow of collapse. Rapa Nui was once covered in dense palm forests, towering trees that reached skyward, their trunks wide enough to craft canoes, to roll stones, to build shelter. Yet when Europeans arrived in the early 18th century, they found a barren island, windswept grass, thin soil, and almost no trees left standing. What happened? Some researchers believe the islanders, in their relentless devotion to carving and moving the moai, cut down too many trees for sledges and ropes until the forests could not recover. Without trees, the soil eroded, crops failed, birds disappeared, and the island spiraled into famine. Others argue the picture is more complex. Rats introduced by early settlers may have devoured palm seeds, preventing regrowth, a slow but devastating sabotage from within. Imagine the despair of watching a once green world turn into a wasteland, of hearing the wind howl across fields where nothing grew, of watching hunger gnaw at the people who had once raised giants from stone. Oral history tells of civil war, of rival clans toppling each other's statues in anger or desperation, of once sacred guardians lying face down in the dirt, their power broken, their gaze extinguished. Some Moai still lie in that position today, abandoned mid-transport, their half-finished faces staring at the sky as if questioning their fate. The collapse of Rapa Nui is often told as a cautionary tale, a people who destroyed their own environment through overambition. But others argue this story oversimplifies, painting the islanders as reckless rather than resilient survivors of a fragile ecosystem battered by isolation, famine, and later European exploitation. Which is true? Was the fall of Rapa Nui a tragedy of self-destruction, or a myth created by outsiders trying to explain a mystery too vast for them to understand? The statues remain as witnesses, but their silence offers no answers, only the eerie suggestion that greatness always comes with a cost. And in the shadows of those fallen giants, the whispers of collapse still linger, reminding us that the line between monument and ruin is thinner than we want to believe. If the Moai are monuments to power, then the question that lingers most heavily is simple yet daunting. How did they move them? Each statue could weigh as much as 80 tons, carved from volcanic tuff at the quarry of Rano Raraku, and somehow transported miles across rough, uneven ground. Theories abound, each one adding a layer of intrigue to the island's legend. Some researchers believe the statues were laid horizontally and dragged on wooden sledges pulled by ropes, though this would have required immense manpower and precious timber in a land already struggling to keep its forests alive. Others suggest rolling the Moai on logs like massive cylinders, but again the scarcity of trees complicates the picture. Then there is the most fascinating theory: the statues walked. Experiments in the modern era have shown that with careful placement of ropes, teams of people can rock a statue side to side, inching it forward with a shuffling gait. Imagine the sight of these colossal figures swaying in the moonlight, stepping slowly across the island as if alive, their carved eyes fixed on some invisible horizon. To the islanders, this might not have been a mere illusion of movement, but the manifestation of mana, ancestral power animating stone. To them, the Moai did not simply travel. They walked of their own accord, guided by the spirits of the dead. And yet, behind the mystery is a practical brilliance, an understanding of balance, rhythm, and force that allowed human hands to accomplish what seems impossible. Still, there are gaps. Not all statues are uniform in size. Some are so massive that even the most generous estimates of manpower seem insufficient. How could a community with limited resources orchestrate such feats without leaving behind detailed records? Did they possess techniques lost to time, or was their success the result of generations perfecting trial and error? Raw, driven by belief stronger than exhaustion. The quarry at Rano Raraku is littered with unfinished Moai, some half-carved, some abandoned, suggesting that the building process was continuous, relentless, a cycle that spanned centuries. Each attempt hints at a determination we can scarcely imagine, and each statue moved tells us the builders guarded a secret they never fully revealed. To this day, when people stand on the paths the Moai once traveled, they say they can almost hear the sound of stone shifting, of ropes straining, of voices chanting in rhythm as the giants shuffled forward. Was it engineering genius, or was it something else, something we still struggle to name? For centuries, the Moai stood as towering silhouettes, blank-faced guardians watching the horizon in silence. But many forget that these statues were not truly complete until the final, most sacred detail was added: the eyes. Carved from white coral and filled with a red or black stone pupil, the eyes transformed the Moai from cold stone into living presences. Archaeologists who uncovered fragments of these eyes noted how striking they were, how the contrast of white and dark gave the statues a piercing, almost human stare. To the Rapa Nui, this was the moment when the Moai came alive, when the spirit of the ancestor entered the stone and its mana, the sacred energy, was awakened. Imagine walking across the island at dusk and seeing row after row of stone faces, their eyes gleaming with coral, staring unblinking into eternity. It must have felt both protective and terrifying, as though no act, no secret, no whisper was beyond their sight. Oral traditions suggest the Moai watched over clan lands, ensuring fertility of crops, abundance of fish, and safety of the people. But once the eyes were inserted, the Moai no longer belonged to the hands of the living. They belonged to the realm of the spirits. Some researchers believe the statue's power was psychological, a reminder to the people that their ancestors were always watching, enforcing order through stone and gaze. Others wonder if the symbolism was deeper, that perhaps the eyes were seen as literal channels, windows through which the spiritual and physical worlds could meet. What happened then, when those eyes were broken, buried, or lost? Did the statues lose their power, or did their silent watch continue, unseen but still felt in the bones of the island? Today, only a few replicas of the eyes exist, reconstructed by archaeologists, but their effect is undeniable. When placed into the hollow sockets of a Moai, the triane's formation is chilling. What was once an expressionless monolith becomes alive with intensity, as if it could speak, as if it could judge, and so the mystery deepens. Were these eyes a tool of faith, a psychological anchor, or something more? Something that gave stone the power to watch and remember. Even now, those who stand before a Moai restored with eyes say they feel a presence, a gaze that seems to pierce through the body and settle in the soul. Why does the stare of stone still hold such power over us? As the Moai multiplied across the island and the gaze of ancestors stretched from coast to coast, something beneath the surface was beginning to unravel. Easter Island, once cloaked in palm forests and rich vegetation, began to change. The demands of carving, moving and erecting the statues required timber, ropes and labor, resources that grew scarcer with each passing generation. The land, once fertile, gradually eroded under the pressure of deforestation. Without trees, the soil washed away, the crops faltered, and the islanders found themselves fighting for survival. Some researchers suggest that the very monuments meant to protect the people contributed to their downfall, draining their environment of life in the name of honor and devotion. Others argue the collapse was not so simple, that rats, introduced to the island, devoured palm seeds and prevented regrowth, accelerating the devastation. The truth is unclear, hidden beneath layers of myth and science. Oral traditions tell of rival clans clashing, of Moai toppled not by weather but by human hands. Perhaps once the resources dwindled, the unity that had sustained the building of statues dissolved into bitterness. Imagine the scene. Stone giants pulled down face first, crashing into the earth they once watched over, eyes shattered, their power broken. To the Rapa Nui, this must have felt like more than vandalism. It was a symbolic death, the silencing of ancestors who could no longer protect. Yet even in destruction, the mystery lingers. Why were so many statues left half-carved in the quarry, as though the work ended in sudden urgency? Was there a final moment when the people realized they could no longer afford devotion, when survival outweighed belief? Or was the unfinished work itself a message, a silent testimony to the cost of ambition carved into stone for us to find centuries later? Today, when visitors walk among the fallen Moai, they often describe a feeling of melancholy, as though the ground itself carries the weight of collapse. The statues remain, but they no longer stand united in watchfulness. They are broken, scattered, silent. And yet the question persists. Was this truly an end? Or was it simply another transformation in the story of the island? Did the ancestors withdraw their protection? Or are they still here, watching through ruins, reminding us of what is lost when devotion overtakes balance? When the Moai fell and the old order crumbled, a new ritual rose from the ashes of collapse, a ritual that spoke of survival, power, and faith transformed. This was the age of the Tangata Manu, the Birdman cult. Each year, as the seabirds returned to nest on the tiny islet of Motunui, warriors and chiefs sent chosen champions to risk their lives in a brutal contest. They would climb down treacherous cliffs, swim through shark-infested waters, and fight the waves to retrieve the first egg of the sacred sooty tern. The man who returned with that fragile prize, intact and unbroken, brought victory to his clan, and his patron was declared the Birdman, the spiritual leader for the year. Imagine the tension of those days. Cliffs lined with chanting crowds, the roar of the ocean below, and young men vanishing into the surf with only a reed float between them and the vast Pacific. Some drowned, some were taken by sharks. Others fell from the jagged cliffs. But those who succeeded carried more than an egg. They carried the weight of divine favor, the proof that the ancestors still listened, still offered power in exchange for faith. For some, the Birdman ritual was a desperate attempt to replace the lost guidance of the Moai, a new way to channel belief after the eyes of the statues dimmed. Others see it as a cultural adaptation, proof that even in collapse, the Rapa Nui reshaped their traditions to survive, yet the mystery lies not in the ritual itself but in the shadows of what it meant. Did the Birdman cult rise purely from necessity, or was it always lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when stone could no longer serve as vessel? Why did the people shift from honoring ancestors carved in rock to venerating a fleeting bird's egg, fragile and temporary? Perhaps it reflected the harsh truth the islanders had learned, that permanence is an illusion, that survival depends not on stone but on what returns each year, fragile yet dependable. Today, remnants of Birdman carvings can still be seen etched into the cliffs at Orongo village, elongated figures with human bodies and bird-like heads, gazing outward as though marking the boundary between earth and sky. They whisper of a time when belief transformed, when survival and spirituality fused into a single ritual of risk and reward. But even now the question remains, was the Birdman a symbol of resilience, or the final echo of a people trying to hold on to a world already slipping away? Amid the ruins of the Moai and the echoes of the Birdman, another enigma lingers, one etched not in stone or ritual but in script. The mysterious tablets of Rongorongo, covered in flowing glyphs unlike any other writing system on Earth, remain one of the greatest unsolved puzzles of Easter Island. Carved with obsidian tools on wooden planks, the symbols twist and curve like living things, birds, fish, plants, and abstract forms arranged in neat lines that seem to tell a story no one alive can read. Some believe Rongorongo is the island's sacred language, a way to record genealogies, prayers, or cosmic knowledge. Others suggest it was an invention born of contact, a spark ignited after the Rapa Nui first glimpsed European writing, reshaped in their own unique style. Yet even if it was inspired by outsiders, it remains wholly original, a script that grew from the island's imagination, and yet silence surrounds it. When the last keepers of the knowledge were lost, so too was the key to its meaning. Imagine standing before one of those tablets, the wood darkened by age, the carvings shallow but deliberate, each stroke suggesting intention. You know it speaks, but the words are locked, the voice of the past muted forever. Researchers have tried to decode it, tracing patterns, comparing glyphs, searching for rhythm or repetition. Some think they see astronomical calendars hidden in the lines, others see songs, chants, or myth. A few claim fragments might record history, the rise and fall of chiefs, the building of the Moai, the famine that came after. But without a living guide, the script is like a sealed chest without a key. To this day, no one has broken its code, and perhaps that is part of its power. Rongorongo feels alive because it resists us. It refuses to explain, to surrender, to flatten into mere fact. It remains a living silence, reminding us that not all mysteries were meant to be solved. Some whispers of the past were carved for the ancestors alone. As you trace those lines in your imagination, you might wonder, what knowledge lies just beyond reach? Was it wisdom that could have changed the island's fate, or merely the record of ordinary lives lost to time? The mystery of Rongorongo lingers, both fragile and eternal, daring us to ask, are there some truths the past will never allow us to hold? When you walk among the Moai today, most appear blank, silent faces staring into the horizon, but once they were not faceless at all. The Rapa Nui gave them eyes, large oval inlays made of white coral with a black or red stone at the center, fixed into the sockets so that the statues truly gazed upon the land. With these eyes, the Moai were said to awaken, no longer stone alone but living guardians infused with the spirit of the ancestors. Imagine the transformation, a cold, empty face suddenly given sight, its stare unblinking, eternal. Villagers would stand beneath them and feel the weight of their gaze, a presence that was both protective and watchful. These eyes, called mata, were believed to channel mana, spiritual power, from the statues into the community. When the eyes looked inland, they were not simply watching fields or homes, they were ensuring fertility, safety, and harmony. But when war broke out between clans, one of the first acts of violence was to topple rival Moai and shatter their eyes. To destroy the gaze was to strip the enemy of power, to leave them unprotected, naked before fate. Even today, only a handful of original coral eyes survive, tucked away in museums far from the island. Without them, the Moai seem incomplete, silent shells of what they once were. Researchers wonder why so few eyes remain. Were they destroyed in conflict, buried in ritual, or hidden intentionally to preserve their power? No one can say for certain. But there is something haunting in the idea that hundreds of stone giants once gazed over the island with piercing white eyes, an entire nation watched over by the unblinking dead. At dusk, as the light dimmed, their eyes must have glowed faintly in the fading sun, an effect that could not have been accidental. Was this glow meant to remind the living that their ancestors never slept, that the bond between past and present while then was unbroken? Today, the Moai still stand, but without their eyes they seem mute, hollow, as though the soul has withdrawn. And so another mystery endures. Were the eyes simply ornaments, or were they the very breath of life, the key that turned carved stone into ancestral presence? High on the slopes of Rano Raraku, the quarry where most of the Moai were born, lies one of Easter Island's most perplexing mysteries. The place feels less like a workshop and more like a frozen dream. Hundreds of statues in various stages of completion scattered across the hillside. Some lie half-carved in the volcanic rock, abandoned as though the workers vanished mid-stroke. Others stand upright, buried up to their shoulders in earth, their massive torsos hidden beneath centuries of soil. Walking among them, you feel the eerie sense of time stopping, as though the carvers simply walked away and never returned. Why? That question has puzzled researchers for centuries. Some believe famine or war halted the work, forcing the islanders to abandon their sacred project. Others suggest an environmental collapse where deforestation stripped the land of resources needed to transport these giants, leaving them stranded where they were carved. And yet, the mystery deepens when you realize many of the unfinished Moai are even larger than those successfully transported and erected. One giant, still attached to the rock, measures over 70 feet long, dwarfing all others. Was it meant to be the ultimate guardian, or was it a monument never intended to leave the quarry, a sacred being carved only for the earth itself? The quarry itself seems alive with unfinished intent. The sheer cliffs are etched with tools marks, rough grooves that whisper of endless hands laboring under the sun. Imagine the sound, the ring of stone against stone, the chants of workers, the crash of falling rock echoing across the volcanic slopes. Now silence rules the place, a silence so complete it feels almost sacred. The Moai that remain locked in the quarry are neither living nor dead, caught between creation and abandonment. To this day, scholars cannot agree. Was this unfinished work a sign of sudden catastrophe, or was the quarry itself a place of ritual, a womb from which Moai were meant to emerge only when the time was right? Perhaps the carvers believed the statues already held power even in their incomplete state, watching from the slopes, unfinished yet eternal. As you stand there in imagination surrounded by these half-born giants, you cannot help but wonder, were they abandoned, or were they left behind intentionally, guardians not of the living but of the land itself? Scattered across Easter Island are Moai that no longer stand tall but lie broken, toppled or half-buried, their great faces staring helplessly at the sky. These fallen giants tell a darker chapter in the island's story, a time when reverence turned to rebellion, when the protectors became the targets. Archaeologists have found that many Moai were deliberately pushed over during periods of clan warfare, their necks snapped, their bodies fractured against the earth. To destroy a rival statue was not merely an act of vandalism, it was an attack on the soul of their people, a severing of ancestral power. But as you walk among the fallen, you notice something else. Some appear almost carefully placed, resting with eerie symmetry, as though their descent was not purely violent but ritualistic, where some toppled in anger while others were lowered with reverence, perhaps to mark the end of an era. The mystery lingers. Some locals whisper of curses that followed the fall of certain Moai, villages struck with famine or disease after their guardians were silenced. Whether coincidence or not, the stories suggest a lingering belief that even broken statues held power and that their destruction carried consequences. And then there is the silence. Imagine standing before a toppled Moai, the weight of centuries pressing down, the once watchful eyes gone, the proud face pressed to the dirt. It feels like witnessing the aftermath of a great battle where the victors have long since vanished, leaving only ruins as testimony. Researchers puzzle over the exact timeline. Were all the statues toppled within a single wave of conflict, or did the destruction unfold slowly over generations of rivalry and desperation? No single answer fits, and so the fallen Moai remain as unsolved as they are unforgettable. Even in ruin, they radiate presence, their massive forms commanding awe despite the were collapsing. And here lies the question. If the statues were toppled to strip them of power, why do they still hold such an undeniable aura? Perhaps the people who destroyed them failed to realize that stone remembers, that even in pieces the Moai still watch, silent and unyielding, guardians of mysteries that refuse to die. For centuries the Moai stood as blank-faced guardians, their massive heads gazing endlessly across the island, but recent discoveries revealed that these statues were never truly faceless. Archaeologists found fragments of coral and obsidian that once formed their eyes, white sclera carved from coral with a small disc of volcanic glass or red scoria at the center, piercing and intense. When placed into the hollow sockets of the Moai, these eyes transformed them from silent stone into beings of authority, awake and alive. Imagine standing before a Moai with its eyes intact, the sheer size already humbling, now magnified by a gaze that feels both eternal and direct, as though it sees into you rather than past you. Some researchers believe that the act of inserting the eyes was the final step in giving life to the statue, a ritual awakening that connected the Moai to the ancestor it represented. Others suggest the eyes symbolized watchfulness, ensuring that no matter where you stood on the island, you were under the gaze of your forefathers. But here lies the mystery. Why were so few eyes preserved? Were they deliberately removed when the statues were toppled, perhaps to extinguish their power? Or were the eyes never meant to last, designed to be temporary vessels of energy during certain ceremonies? Local oral traditions describe the Moai as beings of mana, a spiritual force that could bless or curse depending on how it was harnessed. With their eyes in place, they were not just monuments, they were participants in the life of the people, guardians who oversaw crops, seas and disputes. Without their eyes, they became inert, asleep, waiting. The unsettling thought lingers. How different would the island feel if all Moai still had their original gaze intact, hundreds of eyes fixed upon you from every ridge and field? Would the sense of mystery be greater, or would the height of their collective presence be unbearable? To this day, replicas of the restored eyes have been placed in some statues, and visitors describe a powerful, almost unsettling sensation, like being seen by something far older than time, something that refuses to look away. Beyond the towering Moai, another mystery lies etched into the fabric of Easter Island, one that speaks not through stone but through symbols. Known as Rongorongo, this enigmatic script appears on wooden tablets, staffs, and ceremonial objects, its flowing glyphs unlike any other known writing system. The characters resemble birds, fish, human forms, and geometric shapes, arranged in neat rows, carved with a precision that suggests purpose and meaning. Yet despite decades of study, no one has been able to fully decipher it. Imagine running your hand across one of these tablets, the grooves smooth yet deliberate, every mark whispering of knowledge locked away. Some researchers argue that Rongorongo is a true writing system, perhaps recording genealogy, rituals, or myths. Others suggest it may be a form of proto-writing, mnemonic symbols meant to guide oral recitations. The debate only deepens the allure. For if Rongorongo is indeed writing, it would make Rapa Nui one of the few independent cradles of literacy in human history. But why then was it lost? Oral tradition hints at a catastrophic event, a collapse of resources, foreign contact or war that severed the chain of knowledge. By the time European missionaries arrived in the 19th century, only a few elders could still read the glyphs, and soon even they were gone, taking the key with them. Today, fewer than 30 authentic Rongorongo artifacts remain, scattered across museums around the world, each one a fragment of a broken code. Scholars attempt to analyze patterns, searching for repetition, for structure, for anything that might unlock the mystery. Yet the script remains stubborn, a language that refuses to speak, and so the question haunts us: what truths might those symbols hold? Could they reveal the origins of the Moai, the rituals of their creators, or the reasons for the island's decline? Or would they tell a story so unexpected, so unlike what we imagine, that it would reshape our entire understanding of Easter Island? The silence of Rongorongo feels heavier than stone, for while the Moai stand before us, mute but visible, the script hides in plain sight, words without a voice, history without a translation. If the Moai are the faces of Easter Island and Rongorongo its lost voice, then the island itself is a stage where shadows play upon human memory. For centuries, the Rapa Nui people told stories not only with stone and symbols, but with ritual and performance. Among the most haunting of these traditions was the Birdman cult, a yearly competition tied to the arrival of the sooty tern, a seabird that nested on the nearby islets. Each year, men chosen by rival clans would scale treacherous cliffs, swim across shark-infested waters, and climb jagged rocks to retrieve the first egg of the season. The winner's clan leader would then be declared the Birdman, granted prestige, power, and spiritual authority for the year. Imagine the spectacle: chants echoing off volcanic ridges, the crowd watching in tense silence as a lone figure clung to the rocks, waves crashing below, the risk of death a heartbeat away. To outsiders it may seem like a contest, but to the Rapa Nui, it was communion with the forces of life and fertility, a sacred balance between humanity and the gods. What makes it even more mysterious is the timing of its emergence. The Birdman cult rose to prominence after the era of the Moai had waned, as if one belief system had been replaced by another. Did the collapse of resources, the falling of statues, and the loss of order drive the people to seek new rituals of survival, or was it always part of the island's rhythm, waiting to take center stage when the time was right? The petroglyphs left behind, carved into the rocks of Orongo village, still show Birdman figures, half man, half bird, their forms sharp and fluid, wings outstretched as if caught between flight and fall. They are silent now, but they suggest a time when myth, survival, and ceremony fused into something both sacred and dangerous. And yet even here the mystery deepens. Why did this tradition vanish with such finality? Why did the chants cease, the rituals fade, the cult dissolve into silence? Like the Rongorongo script and the watching Moai, the Birdman cult leaves us with fragments but no complete story, a riddle carved into cliffs, carried on the wind, waiting for us to listen closely enough to hear. When the first European ships reached Easter Island in 1722, the sight that greeted them was one that defied every expectation. Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen wrote of towering stone figures scattered across the island, their sheer size and number baffling his crew. Here was a place so small, so isolated, and yet its people had raised monuments rivaling those of Egypt and Mesopotamia. The sailors noted that the statues faced inward, toward the land, as if guarding the island, rather than welcoming travelers from the sea. The villagers they encountered lived in fragile huts made from reeds, with little evidence of wealth or advanced tools, yet these same people claimed their ancestors had built the Moai. The Europeans were incredulous. How could such a modest community have engineered and transported stones weighing as much as 80 tons? Some speculated that a lost civilization had built the statues long before the Rapa Nui, a theory echoing the myths of Atlantis or Lemuria. Others whispered of supernatural aid, gods or giants lending their strength. The encounter was not peaceful, muskets cracked and blood was spilled. But what remained long after the gun smoke cleared was the gnawing puzzle. This island was a paradox. Scarce resources, no visible draft animals, no wheels, and yet achievements that rivaled the great civilizations of the world. Later visitors, including Spanish, British, and French expeditions, added to the mystery. Some reported statues still standing proudly. Others saw them toppled, faces buried in earth, their bodies hidden from view. Each description contradicted the last, painting a picture of an island that seemed to shift depending on who observed it. For some, it was a place of majesty, a sacred landscape of stone. For others, it was a desolate ruin, evidence of collapse and decay. But at the heart of these first impressions lay one constant, Tian's. He feeling that this was a place out of time, a fragment of human history that did not fit neatly into the known story of civilization. It was as if Easter Island had been holding on to a secret, one too fragile to survive unbroken, but too powerful to vanish entirely. And with every new pair of foreign eyes that gazed upon the Moai, the legend of the island grew, and the questions multiplied. Who truly built them, and why? And more haunting still, what happened to the world that once gave them life? As the centuries passed and more outsiders set foot on Easter Island, a troubling narrative began to take shape. The sight of a barren, windswept island with few trees and limited food sources led explorers, historians, and scientists to propose one of the most haunting theories of all, that the people of Rapa Nui had destroyed themselves. According to this story, the island was once lush with palm forests, its soil fertile, its waters abundant with fish. In this vision of the past, the Rapa Nui thrived, growing in number and ambition, carving ever larger moai to honor their ancestors. But the very success of their culture, some believe, was its undoing. The statues demanded more stone, more wood to transport them, more rope, more manpower. Forests fell, one tree after another, until the island's green canopy thinned and finally disappeared. Without trees, the soil eroded, crops failed, birds vanished, and the seas grew barren of fish as nets and canoes could no longer be made. What remained was hunger, desperation, and conflict. This theory, sometimes called ecocide, paints the Rapa Nui as a warning to the modern world, a civilization that consumed itself into ruin. Some researchers describe it as a cautionary tale, a people so consumed by the desire to outbuild and outdo one another that they cut down their last tree without realizing what it meant. Yet not everyone agrees with this grim portrayal. Others argue that the narrative of self-destruction was shaped by outsiders, projecting their own fears and judgments onto a culture they barely understood. Archaeological evidence shows that even after the forests were gone, the Rapa Nui adapted, creating ingenious stone gardens that captured moisture and preserved crops in rocky soil. Their society may have faced hardship, yes, but collapse, that is less certain. The truth may lie somewhere in between, an island caught between abundance and scarcity, resilience and fragility. Still, the image of statues rising while the last tree fell is powerful, and it lingers in the imagination like a ghost. Was this the fate of Easter Island? A society devoured by its own ambitions, leaving behind only stone faces staring across a ruined landscape? Or was there another darker hand at work, a force beyond their control that brought the world of the Moai to an end? If the story of self-destruction paints Easter Island as a cautionary tale, then the arrival of strangers casts it in an even darker light. For centuries, the people of Rapa Nui had lived in isolation, their world defined by stone, sea, and sky. But in the 18th century, sails appeared on the horizon. The first Europeans to set foot on the island recorded both wonder and disappointment. Wonder at the colossal Moai, disappointment at what they saw as a barren and impoverished land. To the outsiders, the Rapa Nui seemed diminished, reduced, a people living in the shadow of their own statues. Yet what these visitors did not always record was the devastation they themselves carried. With them came diseases the islanders had never encountered, illnesses against which their immune systems had no defense. Coughs turned into fevers, fevers into death, and entire families vanished within weeks. The population, once numbering in the thousands, began to shrink under the invisible weight of contagion. But disease was only the beginning. By the 19th century, slave raiders descended upon Rapa Nui, capturing hundreds of men, women, and even children, forcing them into brutal labor in mines and plantations across South America. Many never returned, and those who did brought back more disease, further hollowing out the island's numbers. The disruption was immense. Traditions were broken, family lines severed, and the knowledge of how to sustain life on the island began to fray. Some researchers argue that the true collapse of Easter Island was not caused by the islanders themselves, but by the violent intrusion of the outside world, a theft of life, culture, and memory that left scars deeper than any ecological shift. Imagine standing on the cliffs of Rapa Nui as ships anchored offshore, the sound of boots and gunpowder echoing across the land. For the Rapa Nui, strangers brought more than fear and curiosity. They brought fear, suffering, and the slow unraveling of a way of life that had endured for centuries. Yet even here the statues remained, silent, immovable, and watchful, as if to witness the destruction unfolding around them. Were the Moai guardians powerless to stop the tide of foreign greed, or were they silent accomplices, their faces turned away as the island's soul was stripped piece by piece? And if it was not the Rapa Nui who destroyed themselves, but outsiders who brought ruin, then what does that say about the mysteries we inherit from history? Are they truths or stories we choose to believe? By the mid-19th century, the island of Rapa Nui stood on the edge of silence. What had once been a thriving society of thousands had dwindled to only a few hundred survivors. The combined weight of disease, slavery, and foreign interference pressed down until the island seemed hollowed out of its own vitality. Missionaries arrived, bringing Christianity, stripping away sacred rituals and replacing them with new beliefs, sometimes violently erasing the old. The oral traditions that once carried the wisdom of generations were cut short. Stories of the ancestors, chants to the gods, and the meanings behind the Moai were left fractured, scattered like broken stones across the land. Even the Moai themselves, toppled during times of civil strife or pushed down by colonizers, lay face first in the dirt, silent witnesses to the unraveling of the culture that had created them. Imagine walking across the island then, the air heavy with loss, seeing toppled giants half buried in grass, their faces eroded, their voices silenced. The people left behind were few in number, forced to rebuild fragments of identity from what remained. Some accounts tell of entire clans erased, their bloodlines gone forever. Others suggest that knowledge of how the statues were moved, or why they were raised, slipped away in those desperate years, leaving future generations to piece together only fragments of truth. By 1877, the population had collapsed so drastically that only 111 native Rapa Nui remained on their homeland. A shadow of the thousands who had once carved their presence into stone. For a moment it seemed the island itself might vanish, not physically but culturally, its spirit erased from the living memory of the world. And yet, against all odds, the survivors endured. They carried fragments of language, pieces of story, and the stubborn will to exist. Some researchers argue that this endurance is as mysterious as the collapse, that a people so reduced in number could still hold on, still cling to identity, still whisper to their children about a time when stone giants watched over them. The Moai, even in ruin, became more than relics. They became reminders that even in devastation, something remains, something endures. But one haunting question lingers. If most of the island's history was lost in this collapse, then how much of what we believe about Rapa Nui today is truth, and how much is merely the echo of a story retold through the eyes of strangers? As the 19th century faded into the 20th, the shattered remains of Rapa Nui began to attract the eyes of the outside world. Explorers, scholars, and adventurers made the long journey across the Pacific to witness the silent stone giants for themselves. They came with sketchbooks, cameras, and theories, each determined to unlock a mystery that had haunted sailors since the first Europeans set foot on the island. Early photographs captured the toppled statues lying in the grass like fallen soldiers, their immense forms eroded yet unyielding. To Western observers, these images were more than curiosities. They were revelations. Here was proof of a lost world, a vanished civilization that had left behind questions larger than the stones themselves. Scientists debated endlessly. Were the statues religious icons, astronomical markers, or symbols of tribal power? Some suggested they were monuments to ancestors, their blank eyes meant to channel protection and authority. Others argued they were warnings or messages frozen in stone meant for future generations. The fascination grew so intense that Rapa Nui became a symbol of mystery itself, a remote stage where human ingenuity and human fragility had collided in ways no one could fully explain. Writers described it as a place outside of time, an island that seemed to exist in the twilight between myth and history. And yet, as outsiders studied the Moai, the voices of the Rapa Nui people themselves were often drowned out. Their oral traditions, fragmented but still breathing, were dismissed as folklore, while European theories were elevated as truth. The island became a canvas onto which the world projected its own imagination, a mirror reflecting the fears and fascinations of distant societies. In this sense, rediscovery was both a gift and a theft. It brought global recognition, but it also rewrote the narrative, often without the certain consent of those who still lived in the shadow of the statues. Even now, many mysteries remain unanswered. Why were the Moai positioned in certain places? Why did their construction suddenly cease? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, how much of what we think we know is real history, and how much is the invention of outsiders eager to solve a puzzle that was never theirs to claim? In the early decades of the 20th century, archaeology turned its gaze more sharply toward Rapa Nui, and with it came one of the most startling revelations of all. The Moai were not just heads. For centuries, travelers and scholars had assumed that the island's statues were merely colossal busts, half-figures gazing skyward from the earth. But when excavations began in earnest, teams discovered that many of the Moai extended far below the surface, their torsos and intricate carvings hidden by centuries of soil, volcanic ash and erosion. The discovery reshaped everything. The statues were not just icons of mystery, they were monuments of staggering complexity, with backs covered in petroglyphs, hands resting at their sides, and elongated forms that revealed craftsmanship few had imagined. These were not crude stone heads scattered across a lonely island. They were fully realized creations, enormous bodies rooted in the earth, embodying both power and permanence. The question was no longer just how these figures had been moved, but why so much of their form had been deliberately buried or eventually submerged beneath the ground. Some archaeologists suggested natural processes, landslides, wind, centuries of shifting soil. Others wondered if the burial itself carried symbolic meaning, as if the islanders were returning their ancestors to the womb of the earth. The revelation deepened rather than solved the mystery. It showed that the Moai were far more intricate than previously believed, and that generations of assumptions had rested on an incomplete picture. It also reminded the world of something crucial. Rapa Nui was not a place of simple enigmas waiting to be unlocked, but of layered histories, where every answer unearthed only exposed deeper questions. As excavation photographs circulated, the fascination with Easter Island surged once again. The Moai were not fading. Relics. They were alive in the public imagination, their hidden bodies speaking to the buried truths of human history itself. And yet, for every stone unearthed, another secret seemed to retreat into silence, reminding us that mystery is not easily conquered by science. What else, then, still lay hidden beneath the earth of this isolated island, waiting for hands brave enough to uncover it? If there is one question that has haunted Easter Island more than any other, it is this: how were the Moai moved? Here we stand on a tiny fragment of land adrift in the Pacific, surrounded by rough seas and punishing winds, with no great beasts of burden, no wheels, no advanced machinery. And yet, scattered across the island, weighing anywhere from 10 to 80 tons, are the statues. They were not carved where they now stand. They came from quarries, most notably the volcanic slopes of Rano Raraku, and were somehow transported miles across jagged terrain. How? For centuries the question has lingered, inviting theory after theory. Some researchers suggest the islanders built great wooden sledges, dragging the statues across logs. But this raises another question. Where did the wood come from, given the island's scarce forests? Others propose that the Moai were laid flat, pulled with ropes by vast groups of people, inch by inch over days, months, even years. But still others, drawing from oral tradition, whisper of something stranger. The islanders themselves once said the statues walked. Not rolled, not dragged, but walked. Legends tell of the Moai swaying side to side, stepping slowly yet powerfully into their resting places, moved by mana, the sacred spiritual force believed to flow through chiefs, priests, and ancestors. To some modern archaeologists, this story is not pure myth. Experiments in recent decades have shown that with ropes tied around the head and base, a coordinated team can rock a replica statue forward, step by step, making it appear to walk. It is efficient, it is eerie, and it carries the echo of the legend. But the mystery endures, for even if this explains one method, it cannot explain all. Some statues weigh more than the experiments accounted for, some were placed on platforms at impossible angles, and others lie broken along pathways, as if dunned mid-journey. Theories multiply, but certainty remains elusive. Was it sheer ingenuity and muscle? Or was it, as the islanders long believed, the living power of the ancestors animating stone? The Moai remained silent, gazing outward, refusing to tell. And so the question lingers in the salt air, unanswered. Did the people of Rapa Nui move their statues with ropes, or with something far less visible, something science cannot yet measure? Beneath the towering figures of the Moai lies another mystery, one that is often overlooked yet just as compelling: the ahu. These platforms, long, flat and constructed from carefully fitted stone, served as the stages upon which the statues rose. At first glance they appear simple, but look closer and you'll see a precision that rivals the work of civilizations far larger and better resourced. The stones, massive and uncut, are locked together with an accuracy that has defied centuries of weathering. Some are so tightly placed that even a blade of grass cannot slip between them, and yet they were laid by a people isolated in the middle of the Pacific, without metal tools or beasts of burden. Many ahu stretch hundreds of feet, balancing the immense weight of multiple statues, their designs consistent across the island, as though guided by a blueprint known only to the Rapa Nui. But what makes them even more mysterious is their placement. Most of the ahu line the coast, their statues turned inward as though watching over the villages. Others appear aligned with celestial events, the rising of the sun at solstices, the paths of stars across the sky. Could it be that the Moai and their platforms formed not just monuments, but a kind of calendar, a cosmic map woven into stone? Some researchers argue this is likely, pointing to similar practices in other ancient cultures, yet the engineering remains astonishing. How did a small, resource-limited society design and construct platforms strong enough to hold 80-ton statues, enduring for centuries without crumbling? To this day, many ahu still stand, silent guardians against the relentless Pacific storms. And then there is the ritual significance. Oral histories describe these places as not mere bases, but sacred sites where ancestors were invoked, where mana flowed into the statues to give them life and power. Each ahu as more than stone. It was a threshold between the living and the dead, a place where the past could be summoned to protect the present. But why such effort? Why such scale? Why devote so much of a society's energy to monuments and platforms rather than survival? Some suggest it was a demonstration of authority, chiefs projecting power through stone. Others whisper it was devotion, a desperate attempt to maintain a link with ancestors as resources dwindled and hardships grew. Either way, the ahu remain, their stones heavy with silence. And as you stand before them, staring into their weathered lines, one question refuses to leave your mind. What drove a people so fragile and so far from the world to build with such endurance? For centuries, the Moai stood as silent sentinels, faceless in their solemn watch. Their towering forms, carved from volcanic stone, gazed inward toward the villages, but something was missing. Then, archaeologists uncovered fragments of coral and red scoria, remnants of eyes that once filled the empty sockets. Suddenly, the statues were no longer mere carvings, but beings with vision, beings that looked back. Imagine it. The blinding white of coral set against the dark volcanic face, with a piercing black or red pupil cut from obsidian or scoria. Under the glare of the sun, the eyes would have glowed, sharp and alive, radiating an unsettling presence. To the Rapa Nui, this was no decoration. The moment the eyes were inserted, the Moai were believed to awaken, infused with mana, the spiritual force of ancestors. Without eyes, the statues were silent shells. With eyes, they were guardians, protectors, and witnesses. The act of placing the eyes may have been the most sacred ritual on the island, transforming stone into living memory. But here lies the puzzle. Why are so few fragments found today? If every Moai once had eyes, where did they go? Were they removed deliberately, perhaps during conflict between clans, stripping rivals of ancestral power? Or were they taken by time, eroded and scattered into the earth? Some suggest they were hidden, buried as offerings or concealed to prevent desecration. Others believe they were shattered in ritual, breaking the connection between the world of the living and the dead. The surviving eyes, however, leave us with haunting detail. Large, disc-shaped pieces of coral carved with precision, inlaid into sockets with such care that they fit seamlessly. Archaeologists who reconstructed a Moai with restored eyes reported a transformation. What had been a solemn, still figure became something altogether different, almost unnerving, no longer a statue, but a presence. And that presence raises a deeper question. What did it feel like to live under such a gaze? Entire villages, whole generations growing up in the shadow of these giants who never blinked, who never looked away. Did they feel protected? Or did they live in quiet fear, watched endlessly by stone ancestors whose judgment was inescapable? Today, when you stand before a Moai with its eyes imagined, you cannot shake the feeling that you are the one being observed. It is a reminder that these mysteries are not only about engineering and stone, they are about belief, about the deep human need to be seen, remembered, and guided, even by the dead. And it leaves us wondering, were the eyes meant to comfort or to control? There comes a silence in the story of Rapa Nui, a silence louder than stone, louder than wind. For centuries the islanders poured their lives, their faith, their strength into the raising of Moai. Then one day the carving stopped. The half-finished statues still lie scattered along the quarries of Rano Raraku, their enormous faces frozen in eternal incompletion as if abandoned mid-breath. It is one of history's most haunting questions. Why did they stop? Theories circle like vultures around a battlefield. Some suggest deforestation was the culprit. The lush palms once covering the island were cut down, used as rollers, rope and fuel, until the land was bare. Without trees, there were no boats for fishing, no fertile soil for crops, no way to sustain the intricate system that had kept life flowing. The island, once vibrant, began to wither. Others believe it was not just nature but war. Oral traditions speak of rival clans tearing down each other's statues in acts of defiance. The very guardians that once bound the people together now toppled as symbols of conquest. Imagine it, the crash of stone against earth, the thunder of centuries of belief shattering in a single night. Starvation followed, famine gripped the island, and with it came stories darker still, whispers of cannibalism, of desperate survival when food was gone and the soil no longer yielded. The same hands that once worked in unity to carve giants turned against one another, fighting for scraps of a fading world. Yet not all scholars agree. Some argue the collapse was gradual, not sudden, a slow erosion rather than a violent end. They suggest adaptation, resilience, small adjustments that kept society alive even as its great projects crumbled. Perhaps the Moai were not abandoned but simply became impossible to sustain, relics of a golden age that could not last forever. What we do know is that when European ships first appeared on the horizon in 1722, the island they found was far from the paradise it had been. The people still lived, but their world of towering statues, of mana-infused guardians, had already slipped into decline. The great eyes no longer watched. The stones lay fallen, broken and unfinished, monuments to ambition and mystery alike. And so the question lingers like a ghost over the cliffs of Easter Island. Was the collapse of Rapa Nui a tragedy of human hubris, a warning of what happens when belief outweighs balance? Or was it simply the inevitable turn of time, the quiet end of an age too extraordinary to endure? It was Easter Sunday, April the 5th, 1722, when the stillness of Rapa Nui was broken by the appearance of sails on the horizon. The islanders must have watched in silence as the great Dutch ships approached, massive wooden beasts unlike anything they had ever seen. When Admiral Jacob Roggeveen set foot upon the island, he marked the moment not for its wonder, but for its coincidence, naming the place Easter Island after the holy day of his arrival. For the Rapa Nui people, the sight of these strangers was not merely a meeting of cultures, it was a collision of worlds. Imagine the first encounter, the Europeans armed with muskets and clothed in heavy coats, facing islanders who lived by the rhythm of stone, sea and spirit. Curiosity mingled with suspicion. Some accounts describe warm greetings, gestures of openness, gifts exchanged under the shadow of towering Moai. Others, however, tell of immediate tensions, arrows loosed, gunshots fired, blood staining the volcanic soil. To the outsiders, the statues seemed incomprehensible. Roggeveen noted them with astonishment, puzzled by how such a small island with so few visible resources could raise such massive figures. He called it a wonder, a mystery without solution. To the islanders, however, the statues were not wonders. They were life itself, silent guardians of ancestors, protectors of mana, and reminders that the world was deeper than wood and stone. But the arrival of Europeans was not only about the clash of eyes and words, it marked the beginning of something darker. Exposure. With the ships came disease, foreign microbes against which the Rapa Nui had no defense. With the sailors came greed, the hunger for land, for control, for dominion over people who lived differently than themselves. For centuries the island had been isolated, untouched by the outside world. But in that single day, the gates of the island's solitude were broken open. From that moment forward, Rapa Nui would no longer belong only to itself. Each sail that appeared in the years that followed brought new disruptions, new wounds, new unravelings of traditions that had endured for generations. The first meeting, then, was not only a story of contact, it was the opening act in a tragedy of erasure, where the world of the Moai, of mana and of mystery would be tested against forces it could never have prepared for. And so the question remains as we look back across the centuries, what did the islanders feel as they watched those ships fade into the horizon that first time? Did they sense that nothing would ever be the same again? The years that followed Roggeveen's landing brought not only more sails but deeper wounds. With each European arrival, Spaniards, French, later the missionaries, Rapa Nui's way of life was chipped away piece by piece. What had survived centuries of isolation now faced the relentless tide of foreign influence. At first the encounters were scattered. Sailors came for supplies, sometimes for slaves, sometimes for little more than curiosity. But each contact left behind something. Disease, violence, disruption. By the mid-19th century, missionaries arrived determined to reshape the soul of the island itself. To them, the Moai were not sacred guardians, but idols to be destroyed, relics of a faith they did not understand. And so, one by one, the statues began to fall. Some were toppled by outside hands, missionaries urging the islanders to abandon their ancestral spirits and embrace a new god. Others were brought down by the islanders themselves, broken by internal conflict, civil wars, and rival clans whose power had been undermined by famine and foreign disruption. What had once stood proudly along the coastlines, giant faces of stone looking eternally inland, now lay shattered in the grass, their eyes downcast, their bodies split by the weight of history. Imagine walking through Rapa Nui in those years. Hundreds of colossal statues, silent but fallen, scattered across the hillsides like corpses of a lost civilization. The mana, the sacred force the statues were meant to channel, seemed broken. The islanders had not only lost their guardians, but the heart of their cultural identity. Missionaries rewrote traditions, banned rituals, and replaced oral histories with foreign scriptures. Generations that once chanted prayers to ancestors now recited prayers in Latin. The sacred birdman competitions that once crowned leaders were branded as heathen practices and forbidden. It was Not only stone that was broken, it was memory. And yet, the statues remained. Even in their fallen state, they could not be erased. The Moai lay like sleeping giants, half buried, half forgotten, but never gone. Their silence carried weight, a reminder of what had been, and a warning of what could never be fully destroyed. Still, the question lingers in that silence. When the last Moai was toppled, did the islanders feel their gods had abandoned them, or did they know that the stones, even in ruin, still held a secret no outsider could ever take away? The 1860s brought a horror darker than famine, darker than toppled statues. Ships from Peru appeared on the horizon, not in search of trade, but of bodies. The booming guano industry needed labor, and the slavers saw Rapa Nui as ripe for harvest. One by one, hundreds of men, women, and even children were rounded up, bound in chains, and dragged aboard foreign ships. They were carried away from the only world they had ever known, never to return. The island's priests, its navigators, its keepers of ancient chants, all were stolen. In a matter of months, nearly half the population was gone. Those who resisted were killed. Those who were taken vanished into the mines of Peru, their bones buried in lands that would never speak their names again. Imagine the silence left behind on the island, entire families ripped apart, clans without leaders, children without parents. Oral history, once the lifeblood of Rapa Nui, flickered dangerously close to extinction. The songs, the genealogies, the myths, all teetered on the edge of oblivion because the voices that carried them had been silenced. And the worst wound was yet to come. A few captives were eventually released, sent back to the island as a political gesture after international outcry, but they did not return whole. They carried with them diseases never before seen on Rapa Nui, smallpox, tuberculosis, illnesses the islanders had no defenses against. Within years, the population was decimated again, collapsing from thousands to just over 100 souls. An entire people, an entire culture, nearly erased in the space of a single generation. The Moai lay toppled, the clans broken, the rituals forbidden, and now the very bloodline of the Rapa Nui people seemed on the verge of vanishing into the sea. And yet, somehow the island endured. Against all odds, the survivors clung to what fragments of memory remained. Whispers of chant, fragments of stories, names carved into wood. Even as the world sought to erase them, the Rapa Nui people refused to disappear entirely. But the question lingers: what knowledge was lost forever in that theft of lives, and what mysteries died with the last breath of those who never made it home? If the slavers had nearly broken the spirit of the island, the next chapter sought to chain it forever. By the late 19th century, Rapa Nui was annexed by Chile, not as an equal partner, not as a land to be respected, but as a colony to be controlled. The surviving Rapa Nui people, reduced to barely over 100, were forced into a single small settlement, fenced off like animals, their movements watched and restricted. The rest of their island, their ancestral lands, their sacred spaces, was leased out to foreign companies who turned the soil into pasture for sheep. Imagine standing on the cliffs of your own homeland, watching outsiders graze animals where your ancestors once carved gods from stone, and knowing you were forbidden to cross the fence. The Moai were left to erode, their stories left untold, while the living heirs of those stories were trapped behind barbed wire. Children grew up without seeing half the island their blood tied them to. Whole generations learned to associate freedom not with the open ocean, but with the small patch of earth allowed to them by their overseers. The Chilean administrators imposed new rules, new names, new systems of ownership, erasing what little remained of the old ways. And yet beneath this weight, the ember of memory still glowed. Whispers of chants, fragments of genealogy, stories carried in secret by the few who dared to defy silence. Even as their world shrank, the Rapa Nui people carried within them a stubborn refusal to be erased. It was no longer the towering Moai that bore witness to the endurance of their people. It was the breath, the memory, the heartbeat of those who survived. And so a question lingers in the ruins of colonial control. How much of Rapa Nui's mystery is what we have forgotten, and how much is what was deliberately taken from them? And so we arrive at the present, standing on an island scarred by conquest, silence, and survival. The Moai remain, Weathered but unbroken, their shadows stretching across a land that still whispers of forgotten rituals. The people of Rapa Nui, though once nearly extinguished, continue to live, speak and remember, carrying fragments of a world the rest of us can only imagine. Scientists still measure, still theorize, still argue, but the most haunting truth is that much of Rapa Nui's mystery resists explanation. Why were the Moai built in such staggering numbers? How were they moved across an island of limited resources? What voices guided their creation, and what silence followed their collapse? Perhaps the answer lies not in stone, but in the resilience of the people themselves, those who survived slavery, disease, and annexation, and still look to the horizon where their ancestors once voyaged. As we close this journey, one question remains for you. Do you believe the mystery of Rapa Nui is one that science will ever fully explain, or is it destined to remain a riddle carved in stone? Comment your answer below. I want to hear what you think. And if you've walked with me through this long, haunting history, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because there are countless more mysteries waiting, and together we will continue to uncover the shadows they leave behind.